It's the month of Spelljammer, so let's talk about SJR1 Lost Ships. This was either the first or the second product released for Spelljammer after the core set, which I've reviewed before on the channel. I've also reviewed SJR5 Rock of Brawl, but I think, yeah, this or SJA1 is the next product out. The A series was Adventures, the R series was Resources. We'll do one other resource of the SJ Resource series this month. And some people would say this is one of the best Spelljammer products. Some people would say it's one of the indispensable products. I would probably agree with, well, maybe both, certainly the latter. This is probably one of 2 or 3 Spelljammer, or maybe 4 Spelljammer products, depending on what you're actually doing, that you really want for a campaign. If you exclude Rock of Brawl, if you're just taking out setting stuff altogether and saying you just want adventure ideas and rules and stuff and options for that sort of thing, this is, in the top 2 or 3 undeniably. It's by Ed Greenwood, and it's very Greenwoodian. I think Greenwood was a good designer with some flaws, some issues, and this has lots of good stuff in it from him, and it picks up some of his flaws as well. It's also an interesting microcosm of things going on in TSR in the early 90s in terms of how books get produced, how they get put out, and I guess what the criticisms you now get of that era. And I don't mean story-based adventures or anything like that, nor am I talking about the other big pervasive issue of early to mid second edition, splat bloat. Loads of player products, loads of options for players, which in retrospect aren't really a problem for us now, but at the time where you had all these books people had to buy, and DMs had to kind of rule or argue about what players were allowed to do because there were so many options. And this is the other side of the kind of issue in that period, not the splat bloat stuff, but the kind of the way in which it's not always clear what products are for or who they're aimed at. Not because they're bad, they might have lots of good stuff in it, but they're often odd mishmashes of different things. And I spoke about this in my Spelljammer review of the main box set, where I kind of said that it was a really good product, but you could tell it was halfway between being here's a rules product for people wanting to do AD&D adventures in space, connecting the more famous worlds, and its own standalone. And here, this is a 96-page source book, and it's got loads of monsters, loads of Greenwood original monsters. It's got several new spells. It's got 20 new ship types. It's got some small oddities and menaces. It has extra rules, and it has adventures, and by that they mean several adventure outlines and a couple of micro seeds, a couple of paragraphs long. So it's a lot of things. It's by Ed Greenwood. It's mentored, it says, by Jeff Grubb, probably giving a lot of input into what stuff happens in space for Greenwood to bounce off of. Greenwood, by this point, I'm not sure it's clear if he was running. I don't think he's running anything regular by this point. He would have been running plenty of one-shots and very short kind of micro series, but I'm not sure if he was even running his library campaigns by the late 80s, early 90s. So we've got a guy who has a real chops, but who is kind of out of the game. The cover is an early Brom cover. It is of some of the ship types in here. It's not the most exciting Brom cover, but it's nice. It's certainly, he gets what these ships are meant to look like, I think, the kind of aesthetic. What we'll do is I'll just kind of flick through and talk about stuff as we go and try to pick up how this locks into you running a Spelljammer game, what I like about it, etc., and some of its weaknesses as we go. So we get how to use Lost Ships, which is mostly about how to use the adventures, and it has a in-character introduction from Elminster. Then you've got rules. The rules about drifting characters adapting to space, space sickness, proficiencies, extra non-weapon proficiencies. This is. Or indeed, technically a couple of them are weapons, but they're functioning as non-weapon proficiencies. Rope rules, space combat rules, spelljamming rules, ship handling rules. Now, I don't know how far this is Jeff Grubb writing extra rules and saying, Ed, put them in your book. This is one of the reasons people feel like this is kind of an add-on to the main box set. You know, the book that should have been in the main box set, as some people would have put it before. Because there's just these things about how, you know, you're jumping around on kind of Age of Sail ships in space, and so of course you're going to swing out on lines. There's swashbuckling. Of course there's going to be grappling hooks and wheel lock pistols. Of course, one thing with the wheel lock pistol is that firearms are introduced into second edition via the Forgotten Realms Adventures book, which Ed Greenwood works on, I think, with Jeff Grubb actually. So maybe there is some connection there. But yeah, so there's some useful extra rules. You kind of want there to be one rule book that actually makes sense, and the fact that even in the core box set there's one book which is really the main rule book, but then there's some other random rules and the other thing, you know, there's organisational issues all over the place. One aspect of this problem in early second edition where you're looking at products that don't know what they are. Then we have 3 sections of adventures which span 26 pages. It's really, one feels like this should be the book. It's called Lost Ships, and so the fact the ship catalogue is 30 pages makes sense. But in it, I almost feel like perhaps we should be looking at a 96-page book, of which, you know, 48 pages are adventures, 30 pages books, a couple of pages rules and spells, and a couple of new monsters. We get a very different mix here, and it's interesting because they are advertising this as the starter adventure book, along with, if you want a full-length adventure, you go to SJR1 Wild Space, presumably. You have a few adventures about getting into space. 3 adventures about getting into space. This is on top of the fairly nominal ones in here, which are kind of like, here's a ship crashes. Maybe it's this, maybe it's this. These are the puzzles you've got to solve. Here, you have an interesting mix. Dark magic is an arcane wants to sell a spelljammer, or a helm and a spelljammer, for a lot of money. 115,000 gold pieces. So that's just if you're an established party already. I mean, in fact, that's at any party levels, but given that you've got to get that money, really, either you're looking at getting one big heist for a mid to high level party that's just been created, or it's a established party. Fallen Star is an undead great master Nyogi who is trying to found a Nyogi colony or something, and has umber hulks and has a great old master who's hatching out some younglings as it dies. And the other one is I Must Go Up to the Stars Again. This one actually is, and that one is 12th level, and I Must Go Up to the Stars Again, which is 6th level. And here you find a tradesman which has an archlich, which is this good lich, a very Greenwoodian creation. Greenwood matches Spelljammer well because they both are merchants of whimsy. And a little whimsy goes a long way, but it really does, at its best, work in Spelljammer, and Greenwood in that sense is a good match. Almost the one reason if you had any hope for the 5th edition, or if you have any hope for the 5th edition product, is going to be partly based on the fact that Chris Perkins is a similar kind of writer and designer. So yeah, I Must Go Up to the Stars Again is fun in the sense that it's just, you meet a guy who's got loads of powers. You might want to fight because he's undead, but he's actually good. So you befriend him, and he's got all his own motives. He's out to avenge his adventuring companions, but he's also just happy to help you adventurers and to fly the ship. So you can have you can actually have a lower level party go up. Dark magic is basically just a negotiation and merchant thing where you get to know the arcane. And Fallen Star is a sort of a very micro dungeon, really one very big dangerous fight. They're all fine, they're all good, and they give more variety and more kind of pungent ideas, imagery. You then have a longer section, Adventures Around the Stars, I think they're called Amid the Stars, and this is this is how many outlines? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's 5 adventure outlines, all of which, basically everything in section 2 Amid the Stars is you find a ship in space, usually a new ship that Greenwood has put in this book. And Yeah, but there's some nice Del Barrett internal illustrations, I should say, which I certainly like. Here, there are lots of great ideas. This is an oddity, and this isn't so much a, I don't know how far you can make this a criticism, it's just an observation. It's kind of strange that the mission for this book, which was meant to be kind of like a have lots of adventure starters, have lots of ideas. The biggest section of what those ideas are, other than 3 quite different get up into the stars scenarios, and they are different, I grant, and I like them. But the rest are all, you find a ship, usually it's aggressive, or usually the assumption is that you're coming into contact with it aggressively. So it's, you're in space, you find a ship, you do something with it. That is the assumption of anything that's not a major adventure, nearly, anyway. Typically for Spelljammer, they're all running at reasonably high levels, 10th level, 6th level, 14th level. Some of them are therefore at the bottom end for Spelljammer, 5th, 6th, but most are in that mid to high level. Slither around the sun. That's quite a fun thing. There's a ship surrounded by spherical creatures with central eyes and many small moving eye stalks. Actually, they're gas spores. They're protecting a lizardman breeding ship. Death Spiders of the Third Or Mage is a mages go around capturing valuable monsters or things, and so they're bad guys, and you're just going to go and stop them. Death in the Mists, pirates. Slaves of the Mist Princess, again, pirates. Very much some of those are trending in, pushing into the Sword and Planet side of what Spelljammer undoubtedly is. There's good details in terms of, you often get some decent treasure description. You often get some, like, say, I think this is the case with Death in the Mist, you get some good kind of, oh, this is a planet they have some stuff on, and this is a planet they have some stuff on. It will take you to different places. I think Death in the Mists is one of the most interesting ones for that. Pharaoh, the Stars Than Thee. There's a Dark Pharaoh flying on a space pyramid. And then there's adventure ideas, which is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 column or couple of column long adventure ideas. Most of these, again, contain, well, either a new ship from here or just another ship, you know, from the original core box. And there's just a basic idea. Most of them are combat-y. Mind flayers ambushing you inside a space Leviathan with a hammer ship, and some other ships as well. A galleon that comes out and it looks like a kind of funeral thing, but actually it's got a bunch of skeletons on it who are attacking you. The too big to throw back is, there's a void scaver, but the void scavers are being controlled by an illithid who's trying to get slaves. Mad dwarves going on, that's quite a fun one that can turn into a good ongoing social encounter, where if you can make friends with these mad dwarves, they might come back and help you at some point in the future. That's actually not Quest for the Star Metal, that's a different one, which is quite nice. Quest for the Star Metal is do a Gar in space. So most of these are confrontational. Many of them are a chance for showing off a new ship. Some of them are quite good. There's a few social ones in there, and the social ones are not necessarily the best ones, I wouldn't want to put it that way, but they are necessary mood shifts, because Greenwood is writing a heavily combat assumptive environment. And it's interesting, you get this with the gold. I like that he puts treasure in, and each adventure has a total G gold piece XP. Weird flashback to the fact this is something that's probably being designed for the first time as early as the end of first edition. Remember, gold for XP is an optional rule in second. So the fact that every adventure that has a full outline has gold piece XP is an oddity. You do find later, though, in the magic items and other equipment section, magic items is what's relevant here, is not everything has an official value, because basically anything super powerful has no official value. XP value unknown, method of making not discernible to PCs. Except that is not how gold for XP works. If you get a magic item, you get, depending on whether you're using first or second edition rules, you get some XP. So you've got this weird, again, who is this book for? Is this book for players who read about the magic items and are not being told what the XP is worth? or is it for DMs to run things? This is actually a DM facing book, so there should just be XP. It's bad that there's not, but there's a conflict in the production and editing that haunts it in that sense. There's separately a limitation in the adventures that too many of the core adventure set are about you find a ship in space and usually fight it. There is there's a variation in that, but not very much. The final section of the adventures, any port in a space storm, starting with a beholder base with death tyrants, zombie death tyrants controlled by Thagar, the beholder eater, who's using it as a trap for beholders coming back to an old base. And so you just got to fight them, turns out. Hurricane Halvor's real cheap space dock is a... One thing, by the way, is how many times Greenwood is like... by the way, unillustrated pages. How often he has a thing where... It's like, to explain why there's lots of air here, there's like 7 crowns of the void stuffed into everything. This is a Greenwoodism, by the way. You don't find this generally. It's something where when people criticise a certain kind of, not just magic bloat, but kind of just mechanical confusion and bloat, often you actually are thinking of Greenwood, even though he's a good designer. But what I mean is, people don't think about the bad adventures they didn't read or run. They think about something interesting, which then they're like, why on earth is it that every third thing has air due to Crowns of the Void? How many Crowns of the Void are there? That's the kind of problem you get come up at this stage as well. It's always there to a degree, but I think the sort of artificial explanations which begin to break in-world credulity multiply, and I think that does come up in this book occasionally. So yeah, Hurricane Halvor, that's a good one it's a guy he's a 7th level priest of Ptah, and that's his wife, sorry. He is a fighter who is basically a smith who can fix stuff, and you can make friends with him. He needs food, you can bring him food, and then there are a couple of adventure ideas to do with him, which includes the Mind Flayer with the Void Scavers coming back from that other adventure. Another thing is the fungus they're growing there starts to go wrong. That's fun. It reminds me of a too short version of one of the starports in Platt's Spaceport Guide from Star Wars, which is one of my favourite. Is that what it's called? One of my favourite books that mine's falling apart from being read so often. Then there are some adventure ideas. It's a castle which is a trap. There's a moon with fire giants jumping up from it. There's a treasure island with... As far as I can tell, there must be some kind of in-joke on that, because there's someone who... a white called Vengun. Yeah, well, we know what the in-joke here is. The lost captain's faithful mate howls for a vanished love, saying, John Kid, what's become of my John Kid? Where have you hidden him? So it's a sort of treasure island literal takeoff, but there's a suggestion that you could go around. There's a deadly trap. There are caves in the rock. One's a deadly trap, another leads to a false floor with a pit of ochre jelly. These are very basic extrapolations of the idea, and you would rather that something else was scrapped. I mean, say the other 2 ideas on this page, and you had a whole page of this adventure with a floor plan. I'm not going to bother finding it, but there is, I think an issue here is that Ed Greenwood obviously ran over the word count, and there's too much content in this book to fit in due to that. Ed Greenwood overwrites like Chris Perkins. Ed Greenwood overwrites, and the way you can tell this is that one of the outlines, I think it mentions, I think it's a thing in the mist, Death in the Mist or whatever. What happens is you have something mentioned at the end by name, by proper noun, which hasn't been mentioned before, but you're assumed to know what it is, and you kind of extrapolate what it is. But it's obviously been cut. And right next to that, there is a sentence. It's obviously half a sentence, and it's missing a bracket at one end. So half the sentence and a bracket has been cut out, and it doesn't make as much sense as it should, really. So you've got things where these ideas need more space to breathe, but because everything is being put in this book, all these extra rules, all these extra ships, the adventures, which might be the most important thing, just aren't there. One thing to say about the whole adventure section, though, is he often he either comes up with a fun idea, a even where they are repetitive because they're all a problem, you know, like a dangerous problem you have to go and fight on. He comes up with a nice idea or something very imagistically strong, or an interesting NPC or something like that. There is, sorry, just to say, here is one genuinely pretty bad line. In one's area of a ship, they find a young girl, about 9, who calmly sits on a cushion waiting to die. If the PCs try to escape without her, she'll scream and cry, begging them to save her. I thought she was calm. So yeah, there's these quite strong images. There's an illithid and a mimic who work together on a ship, which is like a Mary Celeste situation where they're trying to entrap the next group of people into their plan, with the mimic being treasure chest, etc. Almost really the classic version of that, but in space. There's an ogre mage who has like leads a band of raiders. There's a wonder seeker who is a sort of who might become a good friend of yours or not. But basically, he wants to chat with the PCs to capture one of them and bring them back as a slave. So you've got this interesting NPC you can talk to, but who basically is up to no good, but might in the future. It literally says, oh, he'll then hire himself out to you to rescue your friend. These are cool. Some of them really have a Star Wars feel as well, and I think that's good. Star Wars is fantasy in space, or it's a Western in space with fantasy elements. And I think it is right for Spelljammer to push in that direction. And to get some of those moments of kind of wonder and swashbuckling kind of feel with the fantastic elements coming in. And there are also the issues I've outlined. Flotsam of Space just has, again, this is a bit like the new rules section in the sense it feels like a ragbag of things that could have gone in a bigger core set. And the core set is big enough as it is, to be honest. Debris field rules, dust clouds, flame rings, floating islands, flow beacons, Davies, who are spacefarers lost in the Phlogiston, gas clouds, ice fists, planetoids, sargassos. Interesting point here. It says you should come up with 6 or 7 planetoids before spacefaring plays begin and use them as needed. PC activity will probably require at least 2 planetoid visits before 3 weeks of spacefaring game time have elapsed. Isn't that interesting? The idea that this is in some way based on the experience of you need lots of little bits to dot around the world, as in around the space world as you travel, kind of what I've called elsewhere the 3D hex crawl. It's indicative to me of the kinds of games that are actually being run, the assumption that you should have lots of different interesting things to explore. It's given as an offhand thing in a secondary reference book, and there is really no central place where you get there's a bit of stuff in the core set, but there's no central place where you really get comprehensible and sensible advice on how to develop a campaign. You just get throwaways like that which suggest something. Space worms, space missiles, spore fields. There are sidebars, as you often get in books of the era, particularly in the Spelljammer books. Not really worth dwelling on. Then there's lots of ships, and we're not going to go through all of these by any means, but you've got one thing that is quite strong here, and again I kind of assume Jeff Grubb as mentor. Why am I putting Jeff Grubb in inverted commas as if he wasn't real? Jeff Grubb as mentor, I think, is probably driving a lot of this and co-developing lots of this. I think the monsters and the adventures and some of the quirky details on the ships feel like Greenwood, but I suspect the actual need and a wider set of designs is at least partly Grubb. Angel ships, kobolds back in the day when they're around, early human ships that went into space, battle barges of Ptah, which would be temple ships, gives you ideas about what to do with that. And you get these are very nice. I think a big strength of the Spelljammer books is that the ships look good, they're nice designs, and they give you good floor plans and stuff. They are gameable. One thing all these ships have is it gives a description of what they are. If they're sort of mysterious, it will give some kind of hints at the mystery and the options, and it will give multiple uses for most of the ships. This is really clever because it's basically saying, look, this is one thing. This is where it is less Star Wars and more Star Trek, perhaps. I mean, by that I mean in terms of the idea of encounter and exploration being a thing rather than kind of odd discoveries. So the planetoids are fairly Star Trek. The weird wonderful alien magic, swashbuckling stuff, Star Wars, Star Trek again, the different kinds of ships and situations in space, the assumption that you're going to have lots of action in the depths of space. And so giving you different options for using each means each of those is an encounter, isn't it? Each of those is a mini adventure even. So just to give one example, angel ships. They could be traders. They could be bulk cargo carriers. They could be naval ships, which is what the kobolds had used them in the old days before they were outdated. Give one more example. The barge of Patar could be a temple ship. Gives lots of detail on that. Battle barge, cargo raft, or death barge, which is kind of a trap used by undead. And these will give modifications to the core stat line, you know, change to armor rating, change to maneuverability class, what the weapons are. Quite crunchy. And given these rules basically do work, it's, you know, it's useful. And there are, and again in the core set you've got maps, you've got standees. That's an assumption of the Spelljammer players that you're literally flying ships around on a map, the system map or on the battle map, and you're encountering stuff. When you understand the assumptions of Spelljammer, things that many of us would not think is core to the campaign. When it's the same as with Birthright. Imagine if you thought, it's funny that there's all these rules about ruling a kingdom, but Birthright is very strong at presenting that as part of the core of the campaign. This Spelljammer is more like Dark Sun, where Dark Sun's like, oh yeah, by the way, battle system is quite important. Fighters actually are closely tied into battle system rules, but we'll barely support that. And there's a lot more support in Spelljammer for ship-to-ship combat and the kind of miniature standees stuff. I mean, you've got 3 or 4 products which rely on it. Core set, DM screen, War Captain's Compendium, Astramundi all have ship standees and stuff. There might be others. But yeah, you have those, but it's probably something which is never communicated clearly enough because there's no description of what a campaign will generally look like and how to integrate the rules. There's just occasional mentions or a summary of, to have a campaign, you need to have this general idea. But yeah, the ships, lots of variety, lots of things. You've got there's the pyramid ship with different levels of the pyramid with a key. That's one thing. You've got dungeon plans in some cases functionally, haven't you? Lamprey ships. Hints here that the Lamprey ship and the eel ship were perhaps, though popularised by humans, perhaps created by Proto-Thrycreen or another insectoid species. The ogre mammoth was used by ogres back in the old days when they were still in space. Again, before the Elven Armada cleans out goblin kind and various other monstery kinds from space, which in the meta plot of Spelljammer kind of is partly reversed by the Second Unhuman War. Early goblin ships, orc ships, I assume we mean Skro, of course. Skeleton ships, liches flying very easily broken skeletons. That's a weak one actually, because you think, why is this lich flying the skeleton of a space whale which breaks on impact? So really, there's another really beautiful little ship there, the Shrike ship. Isn't that, like, I think the idea that there's whimsy inherent in it. There's something really gorgeous and fun and colourful about all these funny looking ships flying around through space. You've got swan ships and turtle ships, same thing. And there's, as I say, all these have lots of different ideas. The ship section is strong if you like crunch and if you like the idea of having lots of encounters in space. And I think this is one thing that perhaps is, again, an unresolved question about Spelljammer is, how does it work best? I know people who have run it will say, well, this worked for me, this is what I liked. By unresolved, I mean you do not see a single kind of widely accepted, universally accepted way that Spelljammer does run. It's something where it, because of its weird mishmash toolkit nature as a core set, it supports a couple of types of play, one of which I think is this idea that really you're just flying a ship around and having, much like as if you were sailing a ship on the sea, but there's all these weird monsters. I suspect that's actually a less popular type of play, without being an expert or knowing about it, but just from seeing what people say they do. The other is more planet to planet, well, another is more Star Warsy, meta-plotty, Unhuman War, alliances, ancient mysteries, magic, and the other is more Star Trekky, planet to planet, and exploratory. And I think you can merge all these, of course, but Lost Ships supports the stuff in space stuff, which seems like an obvious area to expand in a lot more than probably what the other areas people go for. One thing with these ship plans though is, and this links in somewhat to the adventure seeds, is you're sometimes told, well, there's this and this and you can have this kind of adventure on it. But often you have these micro dungeons in space, but they're not very well exploited as dungeon environments, even though they are an obvious place to have the dungeon of the Dungeon and Dragon game. Short number of spells, pretty functional stuff. Air Sphere, Spark Burst is an aggressive spell that can blow up Phlogiston and stuff like that. Flyfield is a trigger which allows a burst of speed. Disable Helm, Destroy Helm, Collapse Crystal Sphere portals. Debris Barrier, Create Atmosphere. Spells for both types of caster, and just very much you can see that they're developing more on what the core set has in terms of functional spells for major normal things people are going to want to do. None of them really that exciting. The ship equipment and the personal equipment are, which is the next section, and the final big section, I think, before monsters. Yeah, 11 pages for this. So the new spells is 4 pages, ship catalogue 30, personal and ship equipment 11, and then new monsters 12, 13, I think. The personal and ship equipment is solid. It's again pretty overwritten. Lines and tethers is a column and a half, with lots of descriptions about lots of different kinds of things where you suspect that a table with short description and price would probably be more efficient space-wise. You've got new types of ship weapon, many of which are silly, intentionally silly or dumb. They're goblin things, they're kobold things, they're gnome things. There's a whole section actually of gnomoi gear later on. Gift guns, which is disposable, very explosive guns. They're only THACO 17, so you know who this is hitting for 3d6 hit points, I don't know. One thing I guess is it has a 6,000 feet range. Look on the bright side. Magic items. There are a lot of magic items. Some of these, the magic items, do seem to serve to fill in a structural gap, let's say, that someone has identified, either Grub or Greenwood. The Arcane get a couple of specialised Arcane items which they get to use to be armoured and to cast spells, because the Arcane, though quite tough and having some powers, are not themselves fighters. So here's some magic items they're good with. There's a fun one, like a specially enchanted light kind of radiant morning star that dwarves see as sacred to their people, so it's really good, but they want to take it back from you. The Crown of the Void makes air. Discus of Disenchantment, that's very Greenwoodian, the Discus. Or Gygaxian. Greenwood and Gygax are two of the few designers who just have a sort of intentional nonsense approach to some magic items that is very hard to replicate, even though you see people doing it. But yeah, the Discus of Disenchantment is something you throw, and unless it's a helm or an artifact, it becomes inert for a time, and you roll secretly as the DM to find out if it is permanently inert after its 1d4+1 turn inert period. New type of helm, Death Helm, Gem Sword, which is a sort of elf. It's not a lightsaber, but it's equivalent. It's an elven sword with +4. It's +4, and it's electric blue, and has beautiful hilt, and it can have multiple settings for magical gems to cast spells with. Orbs of Remote Action, etc. You got, which is something which you can use to control a variety of tethers and things like that. You've got again, some of it is quite flavourful, some of it's quite silly. It's a strong section, and 11 pages doesn't feel like too much for it, except that every time I look at the kind of length of anything else, I think I want more time for the adventures. No more gear. Again, to enjoy the printed Spelljammer stuff, you have to accept the whimsy. I don't mean you have to be like, yes, I'm going to have everything be ridiculous and irreal, but I think you have to know that giant space hamsters and tinker gnomes, well, they could be fun for some players or are fun for some players, but that there is a Technicolor, like the TV series Final Space, kind of animated feel to them, which can be played off against more serious things as well, as in Final Space, in fact. It can be played off with more serious things, or Minsk and Boo in Baldur's Gate, but you have to lean into that. And I think if you don't want that, that's fine. But what you'll find is that Spelljammer, which is definitely, if there is one distinctive thing other than being in space that Spelljammer does that is different to the three worlds it originally links, Kryn, Greyhawk and the Realms, is that there is a sense of fun that is fairly deeply woven in. You know, you've got your GIF, you've got your Dowa and your Hadazee. You've got these funny kind of alien species who act funny, aren't they funny? And you might hate that. I think it can work, but you might hate it. It can definitely be overdone. But yeah, gnome gear. Then one page of living things with the classic excuse, this sourcebook lacks the space to identify and describe the many thousands of plants. Maybe we could have fewer. It's tough to complain about a book called Lost Ships being a third ships, but every time I'm thinking, could there be less of this or less of this? Maybe, because it would be really good to have a systematic treatment of space-friendly plants, as an example. Then we have monsters in the monstrous compendium format, not detachable sheets. By 1990, you can already see, and there is something almost funny here, because it's not like they don't stop publishing detachable sheets by that point. You know, Dark Sun still has its first MC is detachable, and I think, and that's 11. You've still got 3 or 4 after that have detachable sheets. Actually, the idea of the monstrous compendium with that you got the sheets and put them in your ring binder was conceptually incredible. I think it's actually something which you see people dismiss out of hand, and no, it's a really good idea. It's one of the best ideas. What happens is that you're like, I don't know where the monsters are. Do I have to look at this book or this book? No, you put them all in one book. You collect them, and some small improvements to a bit like improving your ASL folder, your ASL kind of rule book. It's the same principle. You just make sure you strengthen it. The big thing was that I think it became very heavy and bulky. People didn't know where the pages were. People would lose stuff. It probably felt light and fragile. And in that sense, the books and the later books they produce in second edition are really nice. I'm thinking about like Dark Sun 2 or the Planescape ones, including Planescape 3, which as far as I can tell is literally impossible to find, even on DM's Guild, and more valuable than gold secondhand. But yeah, here you've already got a partial abandonment, as you do in the core set. And I mean, as I say, there's something kind of Birthright, interestingly, goes in a weird direction where it just ends up having, for some special monsters, whole cards. They're not punched, but just cards, cardstock monsters with 2-sided sometimes. But yeah, it's already partially giving up on it because it, in this case, it's a book. It's a single book, and it doesn't want to come packaged with separate sheets. And in the core set's case, I don't know. You know, pretty standard across most of the other box sets for the time is that they come as sheets. But they've decided they're not going to do that. Yeah, so it's part of the reason for the high use of pages. As to the monsters themselves, they are very Greenwoodian. The Archlich is a whimsical lich. You might hate it. I don't love it. I can see its use, though. It's the kind of thing that really grinds people's gears. Liches are meant to be terrifying. Why would there be a potion of, you know, undead longevity which you could use? But there's something where you can see, and you see it in the adventure in this, in which an Archlich is there, that you can see the possibilities of combining that kind of character with a party going up into space in that case. And it plays on, though in a different way, on the classic trope of the nominally good undead. 2 good examples of that Sakegan, Bruce Cordell creation, but in the quite flawed Keeping the Shadowfell, H1 Keeping the Shadowfell, quite flawed module, but Sakegan is really interesting, kind of Tomb Guardian there. And there's the lawful good mummy in Deep Carbon Observatory on the barge. That's one that actually is a less effective use, but this idea of the lawful good mummy, the lawful good ghost or whatever, or chaotic good ghost who has some higher good purpose, the Archlich is a version of that. There are many, and it does feel like every book you get from this period has it. There are many multiple-eyed creatures in different combinations. There's the Undead Death Tyrant Beholder, the Beholder Eater, who looks a bit like a beholder. Again, I generally speaking quite like this Del Barris art. There's the Flow Barnacle. That's a useful obstacle. Then what? The Wonder Seeker doesn't entirely make sense if we're honest, but it's a kind of weird chaotic neutral maniac in space. He's basically a player character in space causing trouble and wanting fun things because he's so jaded about existence. The Undead Old Master, the Saphadin, who is a sort of chaotic, good, weird Naga-like thing that floats around wanting to find out cool stuff and watching you and might help you. Shadow Sponges, they float into your atmosphere and steal your air. You can see that's one thing, is that here, as with the idea of Sargassos, as the general flotsam of space obstacle section, space worms as well, there's an idea about the kinds of things that might become dangerous or obstacles in space, or might be helpful. The chaotic neutral tinkerer. Here is another multi-armed, well, in this case armed rather than tentacled creature with multiple eyes. But yeah, the tinkerer can purify your air. It likes exploring. It probably, Kilburn and Elminster think it did explore space. Now it doesn't have its own ships, but it likes to go around in space. It can purify your air if you bring it with you. There's lots of ideas here for how things will work in space. It's a really strong product for not just here isn't a Skro is an orc in space. There can be some twists, but there's no pretense that the Skro is anything other than an orc in space. But adding all these ships which give different encounter kind of feels, different dangers in space, different weapons, adding all these monsters which are designed to be things you fight, flow barnacles, gripping on stuff, blowing stuff up, damaging stuff. Space worms furrowing through and destroying stuff as they drop, and there's a really fun random encounter, sub-chart on the space worm. I'll get that one up. For instance, when you encounter them, roll a d8. They appear in numbers 4 to 48, 4d12. On a 1, they all turn into tiny worms. On a 2, I think you do it per 4 worms. So on a 1, some of them are breeding. There's loads of tiny worms. They do less damage, but there are more of them. On a 2, that group cruises past. On a 3, they don't attack, but 1 drops and dies, and you might find treasure in it. And on a 5 to 8, they attack. It's kind of essentially meant to be a rot grub, but in space. But it has this whole subchart of different things that could happen. That is very Greenwoodian. The idea of, I think he was an ideas mine, an ideas volcano of just stuff coming out. Here's another idea, here's another idea, here's another idea. And Lost Ships is great for having lots of that stuff that works in space. It is okay, I should say, maybe I'm kind of somewhat contradicting myself, it's okay that it doesn't have lots of the planet-side stuff. Practical Planetology, the Realm Space, Earth Space, Kryn Space, those do a lot more of that, Rocker Brow. So the rest of the SJR series focuses heavily, Space Layers focuses heavily on that. The criticism I'm kind of offering there is, it's the one book they published after the core set. It's the book that's really the missing book. It's the one that gives you a whole set of adventure seeds, and they are heavily focused on flying around and having to fight something in space. And I think that is a criticism to take away. Sorry, I've just thought about the monster thing. Spelljammer, the monstrous companions for Spelljammer are loose leaf. The irony. But yeah, you get the point I'm making, is that it's a good product with good stuff in it. There's a bit of repetition, there's some issues with editing, it's all a bit compressed. You wish Greenwood were more efficient with prose, because then he could get more into 96 pages. There's loads of cool obstacles, loads of cool ideas. Anyone could read this, even if you weren't playing Spelljammer, and you would find ideas there that you could adapt pretty quickly for use planet-side as well. But as the companion, as the real resource, adventure starter, equipment companion to the core box, it is lacking because it focuses on a particular set of situations and on a generally speaking fairly narrow set of player responses. So yeah, is it very important if you want to run a Spelljammer as designed? Is it a good product? Yes. Is it a good product for ideas? Is it fun? Does it have good things in it? Yes. Is it a good demonstration of things that were going wrong in the late 80s and early 90s, yes. So yeah, I like Lost Ships a lot. It certainly has been of use to me. Tell me what you think in the comments. Tell me, I guess, what other key Spelljammer products you would add to that shortlist that everyone has to have. Till next time.